Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie. We're glad that you're joining us as we're going to explore modern Athenas and their impact on the world. Since this is our first podcast, we wanted to start off with a short introduction of ourselves and how we got started on the podcast. Sonia is a wife and mother and the director of operations for the Nashville Symphony. She is an oboe player by training and is a workout fiend, hosting a YouTube channel with her workout tips. Definitely check her out there. I am an HR professional now, but formerly I was a biochemist and a litigation attorney. I graduated from Smith College and was also in the military. I'm a wellness junkie and a wanderlust, always looking for the next adventure and ways to improve myself and the world around me. Sonia and I came up with this podcast idea when we realized that there was a lack of podcasts about strong and capable women throughout history. We wanted to start this podcast to open up the discussion about how women have balanced their home and work lives, how they've overcome obstacles, and how they've persevered through crises to become change makers in their own time. We chose our podcast name based upon the Greek goddess Athena and what she represents, including bravery, courage, wisdom, and justice. In each of our podcasts, we'll be exploring a different modern Athena or a group of modern Athenas and the impact that they had in their world. We plan to organize our podcast into clusters, with each cluster representing a time period or a specific topic or theme that we'll explore through multiple podcasts. Today, we're going to be starting our first cluster, which is about the human computers. In this podcast episode, we will be discussing a book entitled Rise of the Rocket Girls, The Women Who Propelled Us from Missiles to the Moon to Mars. The book is written by Nathalia Holt. I might be mispronouncing her name. It's spelled Nathalia. The book was published in 2016. It's available on Amazon, and we'll have a link to the book up on our website for you to use. The book centers around a group of women who worked as human computers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, outside of Pasadena from the 1940s when the lab was just beginning to form, through the lab's transition to becoming a part of NASA in 1958, through the space race, into the Voyager and Mars programs, and into today. The book is broken up by the author into decades, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then the 70s and beyond. The author's research for the book primarily consisted of first-person interviews she conducted between 2011 and 2015. Each woman's story in the book is unique, and while we'll be discussing more broad themes today, we certainly don't want to mislead anyone that all of the women were the same or that their experiences at JPL were the same. Indeed, the author takes great care to build each woman's individuality out within the pages of the book. So we'd really urge you to read the entire book to hear each of their stories and their experiences at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. We first want to start off with a brief overview about what a computer at JPL really was. So back to the book. Before Apple, before IBM, and before our modern definition of a central processing unit partnered with memory, the word computer referred simply to a person who computes. Using only paper, a pencil, and their minds, these computers tackled complex mathematical equations. The computer room at JPL worked as seamlessly as a machine. Notebooks passed from desk to desk as the 5 colleagues spent their days transforming raw numbers into meaningful data. It's also imperative to note how important this work was to JPL. As one woman described it, although she didn't carry a gun like her husband in the Korean War, her life was still at risk. The women lived and died by their calculations. When they made an error, it could spell disaster for an entire rocket or missile project, or later on for a planetary exploration satellite or a Mars rover. In the 1950s, early IBM machines began to arrive at JPL. However, the machines were constantly breaking down, and the male engineers trusted that the computer's mathematical calculations were more accurate than the IBM machines. The women started learning computer programming as the IBM machines started to come online and become more advanced. By 1960, the computers were transitioning into becoming computer programmers. However, it wasn't until the 1980s that personal computers as we know them today became a mainstay in the computer room. The computers who remained working at JPL through this time retained their jobs by learning the new programming language that was needed to work with the new technology. Now we want to talk a bit about what it was like to become a computer at JPL. It wasn't an easy career choice, and certainly it wasn't one that was considered traditional at that time. Generally, in the 1940s, there were only 3 professions for a woman: secretary, nurse, or teacher. The very idea that women could be a computer wasn't often considered because they had no idea that such a profession existed. If they went to college, which most of them did not, they certainly didn't major in mathematics. At best, they took mathematics courses as a minor. Back to the book. Helen minored in math, a subject that seemed as impractical as a Bloomingdale's store window. She couldn't think of a single career possible for a woman with such a degree. However, this knowledge didn't stop her from devouring the math curriculum at Notre Dame. The only girl in a class of men, she didn't feel intimidated. Instead, she felt invisible. Then there was Sue. In fact, the math offered at Scripps College was too basic for her. Instead, she decided to register for classes at Claremont, the men's college next door. Her professor was impressed with her moxie and soon came to realize that Sue was more than a pretty face in his otherwise all-male classroom. So early on, we have instances of the women not really even knowing that becoming a computer was a possibility for them. They were placed into very traditional roles as a secretary, nurse, or teacher, and then were expected to eventually get married and stay home and have children, and then take care of the children.
But I think they all had this kind of almost nagging passion for mathematics, which I really was intrigued by. I thought that was fascinating, and it was essentially their drive. It provided their drive to pursue it once the opportunity presented itself.
Absolutely. And it was really interesting in the book because no matter how the different women went through college and eventually came to become computers at JPL, you could see this passion for mathematics. It started early, often in high school. And then when they went to college, like Helen taking classes and being the only woman in the class, or Sue being the only woman in all-male Claremont mathematics classes, they continued to pursue their passion, even knowing that it was unlikely to lead to a career.
What drive, commitment to that too. And I really liked how they talked about how they found it fun. When they were doing numbers, each of the women, they just felt drawn to it. And it provided them something that they didn't find anywhere else in life, it seemed.
Right. It definitely seemed like they had found a passion and something that was so, at that time, untraditional, that they could really only pursue it in essence almost as a hobby. And so yet they still pursued it. And some of them were quite relentless in their pursuit and sort of taking all of the courses that they could take and devour while yet still pursuing that overall traditional course. So not even knowing that they would be able to continue following their passion, they still followed it all the way as far as they could. And I think that is something that we can all take away from it, is to find that thing that we're passionate about and to pursue it no matter sort of what the obstacles may be in our path.
I bet it was just a combination of relief and excitement when they finally each realized there was this career path that showed their full potential. I wonder, I don't know, that's all I can think to articulate how they might feel.
I'm sure that they were really excited that there was going to be this opportunity for them to use the math that they enjoyed so much. And the book describes oftentimes, they would come excited to work in the morning. And we'll talk a little bit more about, the camaraderie that was built between the women that were the computers at JPL. But there was definitely this excitement in the air. At the time in the 40s, when JPL was first starting, it was cutting edge technology, and it remained cutting edge all the way through when it joined NASA in 58 through the space race and into doing, interplanetary probes and Mars rovers. So they were part of something bigger than themselves. And so their ability to be a part of that, even though, as we'll discuss later, they weren't recognized as full engineers, they were limited to being computers, it was still a way for them to pursue this passion that they had found for themselves. So now we want to talk a little bit about the formation of the computer group at JPL. So Barbie was the first woman computer in the 1940s when she joined the all-male team that eventually would create JPL. Let's go back to the book. If she accepted the job as a calculator, Barbie would once again be the only woman in a group of men. It was a job she hadn't expected, yet one she was eminently qualified for. Math was a comfortable second skin. She would always feel more at home with a pencil in her hand than at a typewriter. In addition, the position held prestige, allowing her to work alongside her husband, and paid twice what she made as a typist. More than the money, it offered her the opportunity to use her neglected math skills. And I think that that goes to what we were just speaking about, where all of these women had this passion to do math and felt comfortable doing math, but had no real outlet for that passion once they would leave college or high school or sort of joining the workforce. Once JPL was a formal institute and money began coming in, there was a need for more computers. Macy Roberts, one of the original 5 computers at JPL, quickly rose to become the supervisor of the group. Let's go back to the book. As the lab expanded, Frank decided to promote Macy to supervisor of the group. He didn't take the promotion lightly. He was also trusting Macy to interview and hire the new computers, in addition to assuming a manager's responsibilities. Macy was a natural for the job. She was the mother hen and was interested in building not just a team, but a family. Because of her, the computing section at JPL would be entirely composed of women. With Macy at the helm, women were hired into positions that they would not have traditionally otherwise held. Back to the book. Macy saw men as a potential disruption for her group. She couldn't imagine that a man would listen to her. Men, she believed, were likely to see themselves as bosses and women as employees, not the other way around. There was another reason Macy spurred male applicants. She labored to find a group of women who all got along, who were friends as well as colleagues. The room sparkled with happy conversations, and the work shone as a result of their fruitful collaboration. As the need for more computers grew, they took more chances, hiring girls with limited experience in the hope that Macy's team could train them and they would become proficient in math and science. It didn't always pan out. Being a computer wasn't a job that just anyone could do. So it was very interesting that early on in the 1940s, as Macy started sort of getting this group really held together, that she was focusing on hiring women to make sure that the group stayed all women.
Yeah, and she had a standard for what those women needed to be still. So I think I was really intrigued by that. And one thing that struck me about kind of the beginning part of this book is that it all sounded like it was a little bit easier to, I don't know, the hardships didn't come across so much in the beginning of the book as I was kind of expecting. It was a little bit of a surprise to me.
Well, and I think that some of that part of it was because at the beginning of the book, a lot of these women were single. And so at the time, even though this wasn't a traditional career path for them, as we've already discussed, it wasn't so far afield from what they might be doing because, you know, as the book discussed, a lot of them basically were waiting to get married and have children and then stay at home with the children. So it was less difficult for them at the beginning as single women to take these jobs and work hard and become part of something greater than themselves.
Yeah, and I think they could throw their whole selves into it as well because they didn't have other outside obligations. So I bet that 100% contributed to their ability to be excellent and driven and committed because it wasn't, distraction's the wrong word, but they were 100% focused in their position from the beginning.
Right. And that's something that I think came through very clearly in the book is that the job was number one. And especially at a time early on when JPL was just getting started and everything was new and it was a small place. And so Macy was creating this team of women inside a pretty small community. JPL's location is a little bit out of the city, sort of in this little canyon area. They're sort of isolated. So the women would come to work and it was pretty much all work all the time. There weren't, like you said, a whole lot of distractions, at least here in the beginning, early years. I also thought it was really interesting how Macy worked to sort of pull women up the ladder to her and then push them ahead of her. And I think that that's a really important characteristic of women as leaders. Is having that ability to recognize that it's not just barriers that you're breaking down, but it's barriers that you're breaking down to be able to pull other women up and then propel the other women beyond the barriers that you've been able to go through.
Yes, as we speak about Macy, she really was a fantastic leader, and it's almost like she was preparing them to take her job, even though she stayed for quite some time after where we're talking about now in the book. But that was really remarkable. And I was trying to think about times when maybe I've been helped along, and I got my entry into my career through internships, which really I was really helped along the way by people who were really just kind of my mentors. And I've taken that as a serious example. And so now I really try to be that example and try to take on interns and try to just take that safe space of being an intern and in an internship to really educate women and men. But I feel like that's been a really special relationship that I kind of equated to this, but it may or may not be similar.
No, and I definitely think that women mentoring other women is an area that women could improve upon. Because a lot of times women will look at other women as competition, when in fact, if we could build this network of women helping women move forward and through mentoring and experience internships, just assistance, it could really be something quite incredible.
Well, and she didn't see those women as a threat to her either. She saw them as an asset and the future of what they were going to be able to do. She felt she needed to equip them, it seemed.
Right. And it was interesting because she also, as a supervisor, held a very unique role because women were generally not supervisors of other professional women. And so her ability to be a supervisor and have a little bit of standoffishness from the women, yet be completely respected by the group and be an integral part of the group was just amazing that she was able to do that. So let's go ahead and continue on. So as you mentioned earlier, Macy eventually leaves the team. She retired from JPL in 1959, and the team was passed on to Barbara. Not everyone agreed with the decision to have Barbara be the head of the computers. Go back to the book. One of the engineers, Bill Hoover, grumbled about Barbara's promotion, believing that a man should be put in charge of what was a critical part of their operations. Quote, "She's just going to get married, get pregnant, and then quit," he complained angrily. On her first visit to the Mojave as a new supervisor, Barbara had little time to think of such tactless comments. So what happened was when Macy retired and Barbara took over, there was this, at that point, there was this great divide between the women who were the computers and doing the mathematical calculations and the male and basically all male engineers. And they would sit side by side, and their jobs were eerily similar to each other, but there was a great divide in the fact that they were both very gender-specific roles at the lab. And when Barbara took over, one of the engineers obviously was pretty unhappy with the idea that a computer rather than an engineer would oversee the other computers. The reference to visiting the Mojave as a new supervisor, out in the Mojave Desert is where they did a lot of the rocket testing. So what the computers would do is they would do all of the crunching and calculations about all of the rocketry. And the book does a really good job of going pretty in depth about what kinds of calculations these were and what they were needed for. And, in short, the calculations were needed for everything from, is the rocket going to get airborne? How long will it stay airborne? What's its flight path? Where is it going to land? And so the women's calculations would then be pushed back over to the engineers who would then go out and test these rockets. So there was this back and forth between the two teams, and the women were pretty integrated into the process of building the different rockets. And so the Mojave Desert was an area where they were out there doing a lot of testing. So Barbara went out as the head computer to go and check out some of the testing and how it was going on behalf of the other computers. So it was really interesting how Barbara took that opportunity not to complain to her supervisor about Bill Hoover, but just to ignore the comment. And I think sometimes when pushing through barriers or up against adversity, we sometimes engage in dialogue that may or may not be a productive sort of movement forward. And the way that Barbara looked at it is it wasn't productive. She could do a lot more of show rather than tell. In essence, be a good supervisor and demonstrate that rather than just saying, oh, I'm going to be a good supervisor, don't worry about me.
Yeah, I wrote down, prove them wrong with actions. Like, you don't have to speak to be able to show them that, they probably don't have the right conception about that group. And I wonder where this guy Bill Hoover was and how long he had been an engineer, because obviously the women had really established themselves by this point. And so I don't know, maybe he was looking for that recognition, or he obviously didn't have the same level of value, which is unfortunate. But I think that it's Barbara handled it wonderfully and shows her as, evolving into a strong leader as well.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Bill Hoover's comment that the computer's work was a critical part of the operation. I don't think that could be stated enough. The work that the women were performing, these calculations, were the basis of the research and the testing of the rockets. So as these rockets were developed, the only way that they were getting airborne and having any success was based upon the women's calculations. And so maybe it was a fear that Bill Hoover had about wanting to control that kind of a critical aspect more. But it certainly almost shows him being a bit insecure in his own role as an engineer. So we want to talk a little bit about promotion. And I mentioned it a little bit about how the job of the engineer and the job of the computer were gender-specific jobs early on at JPL. And promotion for the women didn't come the same way it did for the men. So the men owned that traditional engineer career track. And although the women's skills were similar, often identical, they simply were not considered for the engineer positions. Back to the book. Barbie's husband was promoted to engineer. It was what Richard had always hoped for. Although Barbie's experience was similar to his, she was not promoted and hadn't expected to be. It was simply one of the limits of being female. Later on, Barbara will come with a similar thought. She says, in Barbara's mind, an engineer was a man. There wasn't a single female engineer at JPL, yet she never thought of her job as women's work. And so I think it's interesting that the women came into JPL to do this computer work, sort of knowing what the glass ceiling was at the time. They weren't going to be called engineers. They weren't going to be able to be engineers. And yet they came with this fierce determination and work ethic to do as good of a job as they could possibly do, to get very involved in the inner workings of the laboratory and to help sort of progress science.
Absolutely. I was, as I was reading that quote again, I was struck by how humble all these women really were. And they really were focused on the success of the project and whatever task was in front of them. And they weren't looking for credit. I think that somehow that passion and excitement really, really seemed to drive them. And they never really seemed to be distracted from that. And I know all these limitations were in place, but it just seems like they didn't even regard them at the same time, even though they were everywhere and they would never be called an engineer until later. It didn't seem to discourage them at all.
No, and I definitely agree that they were very humble and they weren't looking for that praise. And like you said, their main focus was to propel these projects forward. And they were excited for this work because they were able to see the fruits of their math. They were able to watch the test flights. They were able to see what happens with these rockets going off. And so it was this everybody in for the better of the organization rather than focusing on their own individual promotional capabilities or abilities. So let's go back to the book briefly here. The engineers marveled at Helen's ability. She worked quickly and accurately. Her knowledge of mathematics was exceptional, and if she had been a man applying for the job, she would likely have been hired as an engineer. This was true for many of the computers, whose education, frequently consisting of a Bachelor of Science degree, was identical to that of the young men being hired in engineering. So this quote came out of the book at around the 1950s area. So more women are starting to go to school for mathematics and the sciences. And they're starting to become, as they're leaving college, as competitive as men for the jobs. The problem is that the jobs weren't there for them like they were for the men.
That's still hard to believe. Even hearing that and reading that a couple times, it's just I have kind of a struggle with putting myself in that place and really understanding the magnitude to that. Just limitation doesn't even that word doesn't even do it justice.
Yeah, and I try and put myself in the position of, say, going to college and sitting alongside a man in all of these mathematics courses and getting the same grades as man, and being as capable, if not better, at the math than the man, and being ready to leave college, and the man has all of these opportunities and doors open to him to be an engineer or a mathematician, and I have none. And I think it speaks to sort of overcoming that, not a fear, but overcoming that limitation that the women continued to pursue math. And then when they got these jobs as computers, they didn't come in with a chip on their shoulder about not being able to be an engineer, but instead they put all of their energy and effort into becoming the best computer that they could be. And as we'll see later on, it ends up decades later, their work comes to fruition and they start to be called engineers and mathematicians and recognized more for the work that they've always been performing. But at this point in the 40s and 50s, they were called computers, and they were limited in the scope of their work, but it was no less important than a man's work.
Absolutely. I'm struck by how critical they were, and we talked about that. But their work was, there was no substitute for it. They were the ones doing it, and they were the best equipped to do it.
And what comes across very clearly in the book is that the engineers relied on them. And so though the engineers could do some math, the amount of math that these women could do, if you could just envision all of the calculations that are now done by computer or by calculator were done by hand by these women with no error. And it's pretty exceptional to think about that. And the amount of advanced knowledge that they had to do to run all of these calculations, and the amount of knowledge that they had to have about the different physical and engineering systems involved in rocketry and in missiles, really, at that time.
Yeah, I love the descriptions in the book where they talk about the pencil kind of furiously on the paper and just imagining all the advancements we have now. And it's very easy to take for granted your smartphone or whatever device, but man, it was talk about from scratch. They were doing it and paving the way for everything else.
Yeah, and these calculations were the ones that were flying the rockets. So it wasn't as though they had this computer like we do now, a computer backup, right, to rerun all the calculations, or a calculator where they can go double check their math. They were the double check. And so it was, I mean, their math was what was going to guide the research. And so if the math was inaccurate, the rocketry wouldn't fire. And you read about some of the sort of more interesting failures during this time at JPL of some of the rockets. But usually it wasn't caused by poor math. It was caused by a number of physical barriers that they were seeing, or unanticipated variables that were coming into play during the flight of a rocket. For instance, not being able to get in a boost right from the ground, and so moving eventually to a two-stage rocket where they could get a bigger boost by doing one rocket and then a second. But the actual math, the numbers that they were crunching, were critical to the success of the entire program. So it's interesting in talking about the critical role that they were playing, because they were also walking this line between being a socially traditional woman and being this mathematical marvel at the laboratory. So we go back to the book. When Macy hired new women, she had often told them, "In this job, you need to look like a girl, act like a lady, think like a man, and work like a dog." And that quotation really struck me when I read it, because I thought, that's actually, it's to some extent still expected today. Look like a girl, act like a lady, think like a man, work like a dog. And I was just struck by how much has changed in 60, 70 years, and yet how much still remains exactly the same.
Well, I think Macy knew what worked and knew what the standard was, and it seemed like the means to the end was really kind of down to the science. They really locked in the method, and I was really fascinated by that. And I was intrigued by your question about would someone even say that today? And I think the answer is no one would utter that type of phrase today, is my opinion, even if it is true, because I feel like people now, maybe it's because all the options have opened up to us, and we're able to pursue so much more and many different things. But I think people shy away from exclaiming that there's one means to the end. And so I think people really respond that they want to figure out the means to their end and tell me what the standard is, and I'm going to do it my own way. Sometimes is what I felt like was the difference.
See, and I think about that, and I think in some ways this quote is still absolutely true today. I think it's just that the definition of act like a lady has expanded dramatically to be all-encompassing of many different types of women and behaviors. But I still think that there's, especially in some career fields, this idea of thinking like a man in order to get ahead. And, oh, you can't be a woman. You need to be more like a man. That's how you're going to get promoted. And, oh, you're a woman. Oh, you need to work harder than the men need to work in order to get the same promotion. And I'm not saying it's true in all career fields, but I don't think it's completely gone yet. And I think that in some more of the more traditional career fields, it certainly remains true.
Well, and I maybe have a skewed perspective because I've only ever studied music and I'm in the arts, where maybe there's just a lot more of a blend. And there's not. I've never interacted with kind of the very distinct gender roles in arts. It doesn't seem to be there where I've experienced it.
Yeah, I would be really interested to hear from listeners whether or not they've experienced this today, and whether or not they feel like in their professional field they are still, expected to sort of think like a man or work harder than the men to reach the same sort of promotional steps. So yeah, I'd be definitely interested to hear from other people on it. So I found this one quote that I'm going to read, and I thought it was really interesting because it talks a little bit about the challenges that women started to have when they were getting into relationships. And remember, as we discussed earlier, their primary focus was their work at JPL. That's where all of their energy was going. So here's the quote. "I'm a computer at JPL. This was always a delicate point in her conversations with men. One of their past dates, a physician who liked to boast, couldn't understand her lack of ego when he learned what her job entailed." Another one. "Careers were never a topic of discussion among the women. Their importance was seen as marginal in comparison to their social lives. It was only among their fellow computers that they could speak freely." And so I found it just very interesting that, as we discussed, they were very humble. They weren't boastful when they would, for instance, go out on a date. "Oh, where do you work?" "Oh, I work at JPL." "Oh, what do you do?" "Oh, I'm a computer." "Oh, what does that entail?" "Oh, it's math." And they didn't talk about how, "Oh, it's math, that without the calculations that I run, this rocket would never work."
Yeah, I wonder why that was. Maybe it was just those stereotypes of, well, women can't do that work, and maybe there was a sense of whether or not you'd be able to feel like you have to convince the person that it was true, or because it seemed like it was such an unusual thing still.
I think it was probably a combination of both. I think that they were probably scared for acceptance of talking about a non-traditional career field, right? They weren't a teacher or a nurse. They did this work that was exciting and cutting edge, but at the time, especially before JPL became part of NASA, the work wasn't widely discussed. And even after they became part of NASA, some of the work was pretty secretive work. And so I wonder if, some of it wasn't just to protect the secrecy of the work, but more so, well, no one will understand what it is that I'm going through or what I've done or the type of work that I do because it's not so traditional. So I just found it interesting to think about, in today's society where we don't need to hide what our career is, when we're dating or when we're, talking with people, because career fields have opened for women, and that stereotype about a traditional woman has dramatically changed.
Yeah, I think it probably puts even more emphasis on kind of the emotional connection, or in a way, respecting each other's knowledge in their specific areas and seeing that as complementary. I think that it probably highlights all the other areas of having chemistry in a relationship.
Yeah, and there was one computer named Margie, and her story sort of struck me. Let's go to the book, and I'll read the quote. While the computers liked to tease her, they watched with real concern as her relationship with the engineer developed. She's too smart for him, Barbara said. It'll be a mistake if she marries him. They simply won't last. Okay, and that was in the 1950s. So Margie was dating this engineer that worked at JPL, and the other computers were concerned because, in essence, she was too smart. And I think that that's an interesting thing to think about even today, and whether or not that would still hold true. The book continues on, and by the end, we have a resolution about Margie and this. She went ahead and got married to the engineer. And eventually, Margie and the engineer got a divorce. So back to the book. Margie's friends at JPL had been right. She was too smart for her husband. She had tried her best, but she couldn't save her marriage. And I was left struck a little bit with this notion that a woman could be too smart. And that's not something you would ever say about a man. Oh, he's too smart. You don't hear that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can imagine that there's still relationships where one person it's just not a good fit. And maybe that was just simply true about this relationship too, but because the expectation was that you would get married and you'd have a family and everything, that and if she didn't talk about her work, maybe there just wasn't kind of from the get-go the realization that this just wasn't going to work, but they just, because of that's what you do, they just tried to keep pursuing. This is a person I like, and I'm going to marry them because that's what you do.
Right. Yeah. And I definitely think it was probably a combination of pressure at the time to find a spouse. But I think maybe it also illuminates a bit of the different or unique sort of challenges that these women mathematicians were facing. They were quite brilliant, and being in a non-traditional career path sort of brought challenges into their social lives that other women didn't necessarily face.
We saw that a lot with Barbara, and I know we'll talk more about her, but between probably the long hours and just that intense dedication and focus that they had too, it was probably hard to maybe break through that and or come out of that almost character away from the office.
Right. And I think that that's absolutely true. They were so hard charging at the office and so focused on doing good work that when they left the office, it was almost a letdown, no matter how good their marriage may have been or their children at home later on. It was a challenge to sort of almost match the adrenaline rush of work. And I think that that's something that women still struggle with and face today, especially, if they're following their passion in their career field, or, maybe they have a very high octane job that's go, go, go all of the time. And it's this notion of, when you come home, how do you sort of turn that off and become wife, mom, friend, and sort of the challenges that can bring.
Yes. I know we're going to talk more about working mothers, but that's where my head goes, and just trying to balance job and home. And it takes work, but it's definitely worth it. And I find that if you can, you can come home and you can detach from work, you're going to be fresher when you return. And so I wonder what the burnout rate was, because they didn't really seem to talk much about that. It was the women seemed to leave their jobs when it was kind of this transition to motherhood or marriage.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the camaraderie. I mentioned it earlier, and we talked a little bit about Macy building the group as all women. But the way that women seemed to handle being a part of this traditionally male-only work culture was to bond with each other. So from the 1940s chapter, back to the book. Despite the newcomers' naivete about being a computer, the computers immediately became good friends. They spent every day working together, sweating over their calculations, observing experiments in the test pits, and chatting with the engineers. And since their houses were practically next door to one another in Pasadena, they often ate dinner and relaxed together in the evenings. It didn't feel like a job. It was more like being part of a secret society. Just like a sorority. When Macy overheard her, she wasn't amused. "You're professional women," she reminded them. And so I think it's this really interesting sort of, Macy was always very careful to say, no, we're professional. We're not a sorority. I don't want to be labeled as a sorority of women. We're doing professional, high-level work here. And the fact that, she would routinely remind the women of the importance of this work and what they were doing, I think gave them a sort of belonging and grounding to the main JPL community while still allowing them that sort of internal camaraderie.
Yeah, it seems like there was kind of a fine line to, even in that statement, they really celebrated this camaraderie and everything. But then if it tipped too far in that direction, I imagine she felt that it tipped the balance and that maybe they would become distracted in their work somehow if it became too far in that direction. But it also showed that she was a pretty disciplined leader, but with it, she gave them room to breathe and be their own, experience their own relationships within the workplace too.
Yeah, and as their working hours grew longer and longer, their relationships with each other strengthened, and their sort of social lives on the outside started to not fall apart, but certainly they were no longer the focus of these women's lives. Their focus was on the 10, 12, 14, 16 hours that they were spending at JPL in this room with all these other women.
Well, and they're experiencing these very exciting things together, and the failures they're experiencing together as well. And I imagine that they helped each other persevere through those failures, especially because they just had to kind of get right up and keep on moving through to the next calculation and the next project. And that can really strengthen the relationships, especially that adversity. It seemed to be a lot of it. While I didn't necessarily understand all the challenges and everything, but when they put so much into this certain launch or this certain calculation, and then it completely failed, and they're probably out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, of equipment and everything, they still stuck together. So I imagine it was that adversity that really strengthened their relationships too.
Yeah, and I was definitely trying to think about what it would feel like to have done calculations for months. I mean, think about it, 10, 12 hours a day of just calculations for a specific rocket test flight, only to have the rocket knock it off the launch pad. And just that level of failure, whether or not it was due to their calculations, it was still a failure. And then they had to go back and tease out exactly what had gone wrong and go back through the calculations again. And just that perseverance through that adversity and that failure, I think, strengthened them as individuals, but like you said, also strengthened the group. And watching each other go through that and helping each other through that process definitely, I think, led to just how strong of relationships they ended up having with each other. The author noted at the end in the epilogue, when she met the women while she was writing this book, she said, "From the moment I met them, it was obvious that they are not just former coworkers, but also close friends." And to think that this is in 2011, 2012, decades after they were working together in the computer room, and those friendships were still forged.
Yeah, I was trying to think if there was a time where I had kind of this group of women, and I had to think pretty far back, but in high school I was on cross country, and that team of girls that I was with, we spent hours of really hard workouts together. We spent a lot of time together, but we became really close through it. And actually, I am still friends with those women today, and I think that is kind of a special but fragile thing, and I haven't really felt that large group sense. Sure, on maybe one-on-one, but that large group I think is a really unique element.
And I think another thing that made the group really unique was this idea that new computers were coming in as some of the older computers were leaving to get married or to have children and start a family. And so didn't seem to be a revolving door, but there were definitely new computers in and some computers leaving. And so Macy, and then followed on by Barbara, was still able to hold this group together and to keep that camaraderie.
Yeah, it was almost like passing of the torch. It's like, okay, now this legacy will be yours. I think there was so much pride in what they did that they wanted to equip these women to keep carrying on this new career, but new importance of their role.
Yeah, and something that really did strike me was the fact that each and every one of the women seemed passionate and invested in their work. And I think that speaks to an idea that if you get a group of women, or, quite frankly, women and men together who are all passionate, look at the change that they can make. Without these women, several of the critical rocket systems that were, later used in the space race and used, for instance, to get the Voyager probes out to the outer planets and then for the Mars rovers, it never would have happened but for the math that these women did.
Yeah, and I was also thinking that with these friendships that are very strong, this adversity and this challenge, they had to be really honest with each other. There's no, I think the part of the issues that we have today, or I see, or I've experienced, is that it's almost like people feel free to constructively speak to each other, and I think it causes problems. And but I bet that they had very honest discussions about what went wrong and there was a lot of ownership over what they needed to do and what each of their roles was, and that probably only strengthened their friendships as well.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like each woman really owned the math that she did, and it wasn't this finger pointing. So, for instance, when a rocket would not get airborne, the woman would go back and relook at all the calculations. It wasn't this, oh no, it must have been something that you loaded into the rocket wrong, to the engineer, or, oh, you boys didn't set it up right on the pad. But she would go diligently back through all of her calculations and make sure that there were no errors and that there were no unknown variables that weren't solved, and, really took every single opportunity to help the project forward and to really make sure that her work was helpful and useful, rather than trying to pass blame when a failure happened.
And that's how they made it so far. They just didn't. It's almost like they didn't waste any time. It was all about the work in the most positive sense.
Yeah. So, speaking of camaraderie, we talked a little bit about the engineer groups, but I want to go back to the book for a minute. In general, though, the women got along famously with the engineers. This was important since they worked long hours together. As a team, they bounced ideas off one another and spent hours discussing how their designs influenced the velocity of their rockets, from the shape and size of the Corporal's tail fins to the inner workings of its engine. And the Corporal was one of the early rockets that the women helped do the calculations to get it off the launch pad and into the air. And it's interesting that though they were technically peer groups, they, had these two very different career tracks and two completely different experiences at JPL, and yet they were able to come together and basically talk shop, talk about the work that they were doing, and build these relationships across the two groups.
Yeah, I bet that would be fascinating to be in the room just to see. Still, we're talking about the 50s when there's, these gender differences everywhere. And there was probably just a huge energy amongst the two groups anytime they got together. It just probably was a very exciting place to be. And it was not filled with kind of the stereotypes and the pressures of almost it's like the outside world at this point.
Yeah, you definitely get the sense from the book that when they walked through the doors of JPL, they were in their own science world. They sort of left the outside world behind. And there's these two examples, both of which I'll read a quote from here in a moment. One about this afternoon popcorn event that they had, and another about the engineers just coming into the computer room and hanging out. But I think that it gives you, both of them give you sort of a sense of what it was like on a day-to-day basis working between the two groups here at the lab. So back to the book. The engineers and the computers made their plans over popcorn in the computer room. It has become a gathering place. At 3 p.m., the smell of popcorn wafted into the corridor, tempting the engineers to poke their heads out their doors. The computers took turns making it in the tiny kitchenette down the hall. As they talked, they ate the popcorn out of a transparent globe that had been cut in half, the hemispheres still clearly marked with latitude and longitude lines. They discussed the lunar missions in terms of technical considerations, but their voices became elevated only when they started talking about the planets. So this popcorn afternoon, you hear a little bit about lunar missions, and that's later. So the quote here comes from later on in the 60s as we're, racing to the moon, racing the Soviets to the moon. But the idea of working together and talking through these problems really became part of the culture at the laboratory.
Yeah, and I think it 100% enabled them to be able to move quickly. And I was struck by how fast the innovation happened and how much progress they had in such a little bit of time. And I think that there seemed to be a lot of chemistry between all of them in the best way.
Yeah, and to the second quote, some of the men hung out so often in the computer room that the women gave them girls' names so they would fit in. Poor Roger was given the unfortunate nickname Bubbles, while Len Efron had been rechristened Leona. So you sort of see this like moment of levity as well. It was, the guys are in the computer room hanging out, talking about the rockets and the projection maps and, what's going on with the fuel systems and why are they not getting the arc of the on flight that they want. And then here's this moment of levity where we're nicknaming the different engineers. So we talked a little bit about this notion of balancing career and family, and I kind of would like to go back to that and talk about that for a few minutes, because I think that the book really explored that with the various different individual women's stories about often how they would come to JPL as single women, get married, stay at JPL, and then they would end up leaving JPL to have a family. And, many of the computers wanted both a family and a career, but especially in the 40s and 50s, there was no Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, like there is now. There was no Pregnancy Disability Act like there is now. And, it just wasn't possible for the women in the early days of the lab to stay working through to the end of their pregnancy. So often, once it was discovered that they were pregnant, they were forced to give up their job and stay home. So here's a quote in the book from 1957. Sue wanted a job closer to home, but she knew that, as a pregnant woman, she couldn't get hired. Realistically, she wouldn't even be able to keep her current job once her employer found out she was going to have a baby. She knew what was expected of her, but she hated the idea of leaving the work that she loved. And Marie, who was another woman in 1957 getting pregnant, back to the book, the accident unearthed new emotions. The accident that the book is talking about now is an accident that happened in the chemistry lab. For the first time, Marie considered leaving science. While most of the time she loved working in the lab, she wanted a family. As excited as she was about getting pregnant, she worried about the chemicals she worked with on a daily basis, especially the radioactive ones. Marie, filled with anxieties of impending motherhood, reluctantly decided to quit. And there was another woman in 1957 who also got pregnant and didn't feel like she had any options and had to quit. And so I think it's one can just wonder what would have happened if what is common in today's world of allowing a leave, even if unpaid, for women to have their children and then come back to work had been available to these women back in the 40s and 50s.
Well, and I wonder if Macy, when she started kind of that tradition of really equipping all the women and making sure all the newcomers, then when Barbara was supervising, I wonder if that was in the back of their mind that any of us might be leaving soon. So let's equip everybody the same so that the standard was really high. But I didn't think about that until now, but I wonder if that was kind of in the back of their minds because they knew that was kind of inevitable.
Yeah. And I mean, just thinking about this idea that not only now have you found a way to follow your passion for math, but you've got this amazing group of women that you work with. You have work that's very fulfilling. And to know that you're going to have to leave it to have a child and to give up your dream is gut-wrenching. And one would hope that that's changed today, but, I don't know that it has in every way. It's still a struggle today to balance a family and a career.
I was looking at some statistics because I think it said 20%, maybe we'll get into this later, 20% of women worked outside the home in 1950, and now 20% of women work inside the home as stay-at-home moms. So it's completely flipped in a way, but I imagine the challenges, I really actually related to some of the challenges they were talking about, balancing when you get home, you're exhausted, and now you have to take care of your son who you love so much, but you don't have any energy left and things like that. But I thought it was fascinating that we really have come a long way in turning those statistics around, but I wonder how much is still the same.
Yeah, and you saw in the book that the tide begins to turn in 1960. So back to the book. Unlike other pregnant women she had seen leave the lab, she couldn't simply pack up her things and disappear. Her position was too critical to the lab's success. She discussed the best course of action with her boss, Dr. Clarence R. John Gates, who had a PhD in electrical engineering. Congratulating her on her impending motherhood, Gates helped devise their plan. Barbara would work right up until the time for her to give birth. And this was really the first example that you saw in the book of JPL starting to flex a little bit and allow the women to stay all the way up into to their birth. And of course, Barbara was an integral member of the lab at that point, and they didn't want to lose her. But there had been a story earlier on about, I don't remember which woman it was, but walking, she didn't want a special parking permit to park closer to the lab. So she continued a long walk from the back of the parking lot all the way to the building because she didn't want to tell anybody that she was pregnant because she didn't want to lose her job. And so by 1960, you're starting to see that the tide is beginning to turn.
I think they also realized what huge contributors these women were, so that probably helped. And at the same time, I think all through this, JPL was kind of ahead of their time in all of these social issues, it seemed.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like it was a different world inside the laboratory than it was on the outside, and almost like they were more insulated from some of the social pressures that were happening on the outside at this point, or at least they were trying to shelter from those outside pressures. So back to the book. Here we go. By the way, here we go into the now we're basically into the mid 60s. JPL was willing to bend to her and to the other mothers' needs. The flexibility JPL gave them to shift their hours as needed, coming in early and leaving early, was invaluable. The job was never about sitting at a desk from 9 to 5. Instead, it was about getting the work done. So here you start to see, as you were mentioning, the lab is starting to take a much more flexible approach to women. And this is especially true for women who are coming back after they have their child and who want to continue working. And the lab is saying, okay, well, you can flex your hours. And today in our workplace, we still have flexible work time, though it's different, it depends on the company that you're working for, how it works. But this notion very early on at JPL that the women didn't need to be tied to their desk, that they could have a little bit more independence and still get their work done, just goes to show not only how valuable the women were, but what kind of respect the laboratory had for the work that they were performing. Yeah,
it's kind of the way, it's definitely in the direction of the way it should be, and that to really show your employees that you care about them, that you're going to let them and value the life outside the lab to some respect.
Yeah, and there was one story about the women as they left and the struggle to decide whether or not they wanted to come back to the lab after having children. And here's one woman's story who did come back. Barbara's friend, Kathy, I'm going to mispronounce her last name, but I think it's Thulin, was back after having kids as well. In a society where only 20% of mothers with young children worked outside the home, the women at JPL bonded over their new babies at lunchtime. The talk naturally flowed from the moon to Mars to first words and first steps. While chatting over developmental milestones, they could feel the mood changing in the lab. The engineers were asking them for analysis of increasing difficulty and allowing them greater independence. With their growing responsibilities, the computing section's work was finding its way into numerous publications, though they were rarely credited in academic journals. At the same time that they were being denied the full recognition they deserved, it seemed to the young mothers that their work was more important than ever. And so again, I think you're starting to see, as time is going on here at JPL, that recognition of the women's work, but also the way that their tight-knit group was able to hold together through, new motherhood, and was able to balance and make that work-life balance as best as they could at the lab.
And I bet there was a lot of honesty about how the challenges they were having outside the lab too, and hopefully they were able to lean on each other because of that strong camaraderie about how to navigate becoming a parent and everything that comes with that.
Yeah, and I think that it was interesting that because of the age of the women at the beginning, so many of them started getting married and having children at about the same time. And so they were able to share those stories with each other. And you can just imagine probably how helpful it was to hear from the other women who were undergoing the same thing they were, right? They were working in the same place under difficult working conditions and long working hours. And though the work was great, it was still very difficult. And the other women in their group were experiencing the same thing. And then they also went home and had to be a wife and a mother, and the challenges that brought to the table.
Yeah, I think people seem a bit more isolated is the wrong word, but I don't know that the workplace allows for that as much. I don't know. What about where you work or other workplaces that you've been?
Yeah, I don't think that it's the same kind of camaraderie. I think that the group that the women built at JPL was sort of forged through the adversity that they faced together, and also because of the kind of work that they were performing. So in essence, they were a bit of like an insular kind of group. And I just don't think that in today's workplace, that's quite as common. I think that people are very invested in their own careers and invested in getting their work done. And oftentimes I think that these sort of more growth experiences for a team or a unit or a group fall to the wayside as people are just trying to get their work done.
Yeah, I'm thinking generationally too, in the workplaces that I've been, it's not like everybody's the same age or the same point in their life either. So there's kind of maybe a disconnect there too, because everybody's kind of a little bit in a different path of their own. So there's maybe not as many intersections as this group of women had.
No, and I would agree with that. And I think that as the workplace has become more diverse and you're bringing in people from all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences and cultural perspectives, I think that people aren't necessarily taking the time to learn what they have in common with each other because they don't have that kind of time because the work is so demanding. So I think that it definitely has changed. So speaking of change, we're going to go back here to the book. Eventually the team was passed from Barbara down to Helen Ling, who was unapologetic in the way that she was going to carry on Macy's tradition of hiring solely women for the computer room. As the book says, if you wanted to be one of Helen's team, you certainly had to be a woman. Helen's mentoring encompassed not just the importance of advanced degrees, but also the balance of working while raising children. Helen had been following this vision for a decade, watching as her hires worked their way up the ranks, but now she was really stepping up her numbers. Grandfathered into her position as an engineer, she had no need of a degree, yet she pushed the coursework on every woman she hired. So this quote's a little bit further on in the book, but Helen made a big push to get the women, the computers, working towards advanced degrees, and if they hadn't finished college, getting their college degree and really pushing them up the ladder. And I was talking earlier about how Macy pulled those up below the ladder to be at her ladder rung and then push people ahead of her. And Helen was yet another example. Watching Macy, this is how the group worked. You pulled the women up and then you pushed them and propelled them forward. And I think that just doesn't happen as much today as it should. I think people are maybe intimidated by the idea of mentoring another woman. I think that people are very wrapped up in their own careers and their own lives, and the idea of propelling other women forward beyond the barriers that you've managed to break can be just an exhausting experience or idea.
I think there's probably also a challenge to get everybody on board and focused on the project at hand and really making that the successful goal. And that, I think, too, because there was such this high standard in this high pressure situation where if they made a wrong calculation, that things would be an utter failure. So this high level of excellence was expected. And so I think that maybe in a way now people can become a little bit more complacent where they are, or maybe the pressures are different, but that sense of teamwork, I almost wonder if it was that strong everywhere. I mean, where would we be as a civilization? Because if so many things would be advancing even more efficiently.
Yeah, I agree. So in 1970, the Equal Pay Act was passed. And this is really when the barrier between the engineers and the computers came to an end. So back to the book. Known as computers since the lab's inception, they were now officially engineers. It was a breakthrough as big as landing on the moon. Their work had been steadily increasing in importance for years, and now they had the title to match their experience. For women like Helen, Barbara, and Margie, who had worked there for years, it was worth far more than anything a beauty pageant title could possibly bestow. And that's a reference to this beauty pageant that they held every year at JPL called the Queen of Outer Space contest. And the beauty pageant ended about the same time as Equal Pay Act came. It was interesting to note in the book, quote, despite their groundbreaking promotions, there remained a gulf between the men and women. Not only an economic divide, since the men did earn more, but a physical one. The men and women remained working on different floors at JPL. And so you have this experience where finally they're getting the professional recognition that they've deserved for 30 years. And yet at the same time, they can't seem to break all the way through the glass ceiling. They're still separate from the men, and the men are still earning more money than they are.
I still don't understand, why maybe that's still the case. Why there's kind of, people talk about men and women not making the same for the same job. It's interesting how that has not fallen away yet.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also this, whenever you break through a barrier, there's another barrier to break. And so it's this whole topic about them becoming engineers made me really realize how much they had to persevere through the adversity to just break barrier after barrier after barrier during the decades that they were at JPL to even get to a position where they were viewed as equals to the engineers in 1970 when the Equal Pay Act finally came through and enacted. But just the fact that they continued to have to break these barriers and the fact that they never gave up. They just continued forging ahead and they continued working hard and they continued pushing.
They must have had a long-term vision, each of them, about where this path was going to go. I mean, and that's kind of incredible to me. I wonder what they thought was going to be possible. I mean, amazing things happened, but I wonder where they thought all of this was going to go too. But they had a tremendous amount of commitment, and maybe it's faith or whatever you want to call it. But I bet that long-term vision was really something that propelled them forward and kept drawing them closer and closer and through those barriers.
Yeah, there was another quote I'm going to read here in a second from the early part of 2000, 2001, that sort of time frame as the Mars rover program is starting to come online. And I think the quote really symbolizes at JPL how far the women had come and what they had done. So back to the book. Donna Shirley, the manager of the Mars exploration program and one of Sylvia's supervisors, looked around the room. All the engineers at the table were women. It was the first time Donna could remember such a thing happening. The times, they are a-changing, she thought. So here we are, not 15 years ago, And you have this table of all women engineers. I mean, this is the legacy that the computers left behind at JPL. And back to the book. The proportion of female engineers at the lab increased from 9% in 1984 to 15% in 1994. Today, more women are employed at JPL in all positions than at any other NASA center. It's an achievement made possible by Macy and Helen and their tireless campaign to hire women over the course of 50 years. The expansion of women's roles at JPL stands in sharp contrast to the trends in the rest of the country. And so I think it's just when you hear those statistics and you really think about what these women did long term for the laboratory and for science, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and how easy I imagine it would be for any of us today who are now picking careers or going to school just to kind of take for granted all that adversity that they just powered through. And just, I mean, it's really incredible when you dive in and see how long it took and how persistent they had to be. And it's important that we don't take that for granted. We live on that legacy. And so what is the next step? I'm not sure, but we have to keep moving forward.
Right. And I think it's recognizing how hard it's been to get to where we are now and how much work we still have to go, and not being intimidated by the work that's ahead. You know, these women took one small step and took then another small step and another small step, and look at what it led to, a table of all women engineers for the Mars exploration program. That's no small feat. And it wasn't done overnight. It wasn't done through, activist work. It was done through hard work and showing what women could do.
And they're the best equipped for the job. And, I think they happen to be women too, because they were the best people equipped for the job were all given the same opportunities now. But it's nothing to, they're there sitting at that table because they are the best ones and the most excellent people for the job too. So it's this, I think that standard of excellence, when that's pursued, the progress is going to be everybody's at the same time. It's going to be, I'm just totally energized by that quote that you just read.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is energizing. And I think that, this notion that women at JPL, this legacy that they left behind through their hard work and their dedication to the projects, and just being humble, not looking for individual praise or accomplishment, but working for the good of the team, and look at what it led to long term. And so I think, something that I walked away from this book thinking was, wow, building up a group of strong women and creating that camaraderie of a team in the workplace is so critical to success.
And somehow stripping away everything that stands in front of that, everything that we place in front of ourselves, whether that's not being able to take feedback, at times, and not, I think they worked so well with each other and were honest with each other, and they really cared about each other so that they wanted the best for the project, but they also didn't hold anything back, I bet. I mean, they wanted everyone to be as excellent as they could be. And I don't always see that in every instance that I've been in the workplace. And so I wonder how would all of our lives change if we could really strive for that team every day?
Right. And focusing on the good of the team and what can I do for the team to make the team better. And part of that, like you were mentioning, is to strive for personal excellence and making sure that your work is, tight and put together, and you do the best job that you can do on your work, but also realizing that you have an obligation to the team to ensure that the team is as best as it can be. And, these women never took a failed test, personally, in the sense of it ruining their sort of keeping their focus on the long game. It was always, okay, this test failed. Good. Let's learn from it. Let's figure out what went wrong, and let's do a better job on the next test. And that's something that I walked away from the book thinking of, making sure that when you have a failure, that you're learning from it, that you're figuring out what went wrong so that it doesn't happen again, and not just saying, oh, it's a failure and just ignoring it.
And taking time out, I'm sure, every day in that workplace to make sure, is my team as strong as it can be? Are we working as a team? And I know I've been really focusing on that recently, and how I can even better equip them, but also maintain the balance between letting them shine and do what they do best, but stay connected to, the details and support them.
Right. And I think it's a challenge because you have to balance getting the work done. Whatever field you're in, there's some kind of a service or product that your team's expected to deliver. And so it's making sure that that product or service gets delivered, while at the same time sort of making sure that your team is being held together and is building that camaraderie that's going to serve them well over the long term. So on that note, that's all that we have for today. We want to thank everybody for listening and downloading and sharing this experience with us. We're going to be compiling questions throughout each cluster that we'll then answer in a Q&A podcast at the end of the cluster. So if you have questions or comments that you want to make about the podcast, or just want to connect with us, we have our website at modernathenas.com, our Facebook page, which is also under Modern Athenas, 2 words, and our Twitter account at Modern Athenas. Our website's also going to have additional links and information related to this cluster, so we urge you to just check it out and read more about these amazing women and the work that they did. Our next podcast, we're going to remain here in the Human Computers cluster, and we'll be covering a book called Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. And the book's recently been made into a movie, but we're going to be focusing on the book in our podcast and not on the movie. So as we leave you today, we want to remind you to never forget that each of you, like each of the modern Athenas we discussed today, has the power and capacity to be a change maker in your world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.